Hello and welcome. I am Professor Emeritus Daniel Asia at the University of Arizona and also President of the Center for American Culture and Ideas. I welcome all of you, that includes members of the class Human Achievement and Innovation in the Arts, and all others from around the country and the world who have tuned into our Cultured Mind Forum. Today is, of course, a celebration of Martin Luther King Jr. He is revered for his work in civil rights. Martin Luther King said the following. Remember, he was a Christian pastor. God has wrought many things out of oppression. He has endowed his creatures with the capacity to create. And from this capacity has flowed the sweet songs of sorrow and joy that have allowed man to cope with his environment and many different situations. It's a pleasure today to welcome Dr. James Harrigan to talk to us and help us celebrate in a truly meaningful way the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. Harrigan is a former senior research fellow at the American Institute of Economic Research. He is also co-host of the Words and Numbers podcast. Do check it out. And a senior fellow at the Center for American Culture and Ideas. Dr. Harrigan was previously Dean of the American University of Iraq, Suleimani, and later served as Director of Academic Programs at the Institute for Humane Studies and Strata, where he was also a senior research fellow. Dr. Harrigan has written extensively for the popular press, with articles appearing in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, U.S. News and World Report, and a host of other outlets. He is also co-author of Cooperation and Coercion. His current work focuses on the intersections between political economy, public policy, and political philosophy. He is currently working on a book regarding popular culture. Please welcome Dr. James Harrigan.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate that lovely introduction. And hello to all of you who have come to think about Martin Luther King on his day, even though this year Martin Luther King Day is celebrated on Inauguration Day, which is a strange conflagration of political calendars. But here we are. And, you know, when somebody's asked to give a brief talk on Martin Luther King Day, it's almost as if, you know, every single person who's ever spoken at a graduation had an incurable urge to talk about two paths diverging in the wood and this kind of thing. When you end up talking about Martin Luther King, you really end up talking about the there we go, the speech he gave at the March on Washington. That would have been in August of 1963, where he gave this incredible soundbite. We didn't call them sound bites back in 63, but there it is. And I'm going to resist that urge and just move on. I mean, I will point out that the March on Washington was a real seminal moment in American history, and especially during the civil rights period of the 1960s. But it's not exactly what we're going to talk about today. Not exactly. The second thing that people are drawn to when they think about Martin Luther King is the letter from a Birmingham City jail written in April of 1963. 63 was actually a pretty big year. And this high point of American political rhetoric is something that we are going to talk about a little bit. How does a man like Martin Luther King end up in a Birmingham city jail? And what's he thinking as he sits there waiting to be let out? Because, of course, he knew he would be let out. But really, what I want to talk about, for the most part, would be his very final speech. It would have been April 3rd, 1964. Um, it was a difficult, or in 1968, pardon me. It was a very difficult period in American history. We like to think that we live in very trying times and everything now is worse than it's ever been. And that's just simply not true. You can point to any number of times in our history where things were quite a lot worse. In 1968, probably as bad as it's been in the 20th and 21st centuries. And I keep in mind that there were other bad enough times in the 20th century specifically. And yet 1968, so much worse. It was an incredibly turbulent year, probably the most turbulent in 100 years plus or minus in American history. I'll just give you a little taste of what 1968 was like prior to Martin Luther King's talk, his final speech. In January 15th of the year, a woman named Jeanette Rankin, if you haven't heard that name, you should look it up, leads 500 women on a march, 5,000 women, pardon me, on a march in Washington to protest the Vietnam War, which was a real social issue at that time, more so than I think most of us now can appreciate. In January, the North Vietnamese launched what was known as the Tet Offensive, and another thing you should look up if you haven't heard of it. And throughout 1968, 296,000 men were drafted to serve in Vietnam. 296,000. To give you an idea of the scope of that, Tucson had about 281,000 residents in 1968. So imagine the entirety of Tucson being lifted and sent to fight in Vietnam. In February, two Memphis sanitation workers, and this is where it starts to become important and personal for Martin Luther King, Ethel Cole and Robert Walker, were crushed to death by a malfunctioning garbage truck. And their deaths led to a strike that in turn led to a civil rights movement in Memphis. In February, again, February 8th, South Carolina State University students started a bonfire on the front of their campus. It's in Orangeburg, South Carolina, and as police and firefighters attempt to put it out, a police officer was injured by something that was thrown, and that's about as much as anybody knows with any certainty what happened. And highway patrol officers opened fire on the protesters, 3 of whom were killed, all African-American males. 28 others injured very badly. The 3 that were killed, 2 were 18-year-old college students, and 1 was a 17-year-old high school student. By February 27th, this man, the voice of America, Walter Cronkite, says on his tour of Vietnam that the U.S. war effort is, quote, mired in stalemate. And a malaise just kind of sets out over the country, over the war, and over what's going on socially here. And in February, the Kerner Commission, a commission appointed by President Lyndon Johnson, he'll become important again in a moment, to examine the causes of race riots in American cities, declares that the nation is, quote, moving toward 2 societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. It's all starting to sound kind of familiar over American history at this point. Separate and unequal is the problem when Brown versus Board of Education is decided in the 1950s. You're into the 60s now. No real improvement. In March, 15,000 Latino high school students in Los Angeles walk out of classes in protest to demand for a better education. Howard University, a black university in Washington, D.C., is taken over by its students seeking a greater voice in student discipline and in the curriculum. And as war pressures mount, Lyndon Johnson, who in 1964, think about this for a second, won 61% of the popular vote in the United States to Barry Goldwater's 39, announces that he's not even running for re-election. 61.1% of the popular vote, which he won, is the highest percentage anybody has ever won in elections for which data is available. And yet, he decided he wasn't going to run anymore. Which brings us to April 3rd, 1968. April 3rd. Remember, February 1st saw Ethel Cole and Robert Walker, the two sanitation workers, crushed to death in the machinery they used to do their jobs. This led to the movement which saw King deliver his absolute last speech, the final speech of his life, and it's become known as the I've Been to the Mountaintop speech. And it opens thusly. If I were standing at the beginning of time with the possibility of taking a kind of general and panoramic view of the whole of human history up till now, and the Almighty said to me, Martin Luther King, which age would you like to live in? And that's a question we should all think about from time to time. And knowing the scope and sweep of human history, I think about this often. And while it would be fascinating to live through ancient Greek times, ancient Roman times, the American founding era, well, the correct answer to this question, by and large, is always right now or at some point in the future, because human life just keeps getting better. So what was Martin Luther King's answer to this question? I would turn to the Almighty, he spoke that day, and say, if you allow me to live just a few years in the second half of the 20th century, I'll be happy. Think about this. He's living in one of the most turbulent years there ever was in American history. He's at the forefront of a civil rights movement working to achieve equality for his own people in the midst of a larger group that could also be called his own people. Blacks on the one hand, Americans on the other. There seems to be no way for any of that to happen, and yet, when asked when he would live, he would pick then. But why? Things were really horrible in 1968. And yet, he thought that was when the greatest victories would be possible. That as bad as things were, and they were, he wasn't going to sugarcoat it and never did. It was nonetheless the case that at this moment, when everything seems at its worst, that's when everything could actually get better. And here we see Martin Luther King's tremendous optimism. And it defined him, his optimism. And I think he drew it from the American optimism that defines our country so well and almost always has. We had forgotten it in 1968, and he was there to remind us, which was, I think, a good and wonderful thing. He went on to say, we don't have to argue with anybody. We don't have to curse and go around acting bad with our words. We don't need any bricks and bottles. We don't need any Molotov cocktails. Here he's speaking directly against the approach advocated by Malcolm X. They provided two great bookends of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. King with nonviolence and Malcolm X by any means necessary. Luckily, the American people listened to both and chose King. It didn't have to go that way. Later, King said, we just need to go around to these stores and to these massive industries in our country and say, God sent us by here to say that you're not treating his children right. And we've come by here to ask you to make the first item on your agenda fair treatment, where God's children are concerned. Now, if you're not prepared to do that, we do have an agenda that we must follow, and our agenda calls for withdrawing economic support from you. So he's threatening business owners with the loss of black business. And yet, any rational person would ask, what would that really matter? Weren't the blacks the poorest of the poor in the United States at that time? And we'll talk about whether they still might be the poorest group in America even at this time. How could you take a bunch of poverty-ridden people and orchestrate their behavior in the marketplace such that shopkeepers and business owners would decide to change the way they were treating certain human beings simply because they feared the loss of the business revenue? And King knew it. He said, "We are poor people. Individually, we are poor. When you compare us with white society in America, we are poor. Never stop and forget that collectively. That means all of us together. Collectively, we are richer than all the nations in the world, with the exception of 9. Did you ever think about that? The American Negro collectively is richer than most nations of the world. We have an annual income of more than $30 billion a year, which is more than all the exports of the United States and more than the national budget of Canada. Did you know that? That's power right there if we know how to pool it. And when you start to think about things that way, well, maybe change is possible with certain actions in the marketplace. So when, and understand that this is not an if question for King, but a when question, right? There was this idea that it was going to happen, it had to. And yet, when you press Martin Luther King on the idea of time and what time has meant to blacks in America since the founding, and you think about the founding in 1776 and 1787, two very distinctly different periods in which slavery was sadly not dismantled, primarily because it couldn't have been, but that's a discussion for another day. The fact of the matter was is that one group of people was brought to the United States in chains and then left out of the equation when Jefferson said all men are created equal, and then a group of men in Philadelphia in 1787 devised the American Constitution and the American government that flowed from it. Blacks would just have to wait for their freedom. 1797, 1907, 1917, decade after decade after decade pass, all to no effect for those who were enslaved. It wasn't until the Civil War, which began in 1860, 80 years after the American founding, 80 years before we're even in a place where we could talk about what could happen next in order to free our black then to become citizens. And Martin Luther King knew about time, and he talked about it in his letter from a Birmingham City jail, I think in the most poignant way it's ever been discussed in American history. He said, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. For years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied." Okay, 1963, King is tired of waiting. And who, incidentally, did he blame? Did he blame racists in America for saying wait to the blacks who needed their freedom, who needed segregation to go by the wayside? He did not, although he never showed any real love for racists, I think deservedly so. He pointed his eyes at what he called the American moderates, regular people who wanted what was best for everyone, but who saw that upsetting the apple cart would make for all kinds of social problems that would then have to be dealt with. And it would be better, in their estimation, if the blacks just waited until that wasn't the necessary outcome. And King was here to tell you in 1963 that when he hears wait, he does hear never. And who's responsible? Racists? No, regular, good, decent people. And it's time for good, decent people to change their approach to these things. But by 1968, he's saying something completely different. He says, I don't know what will happen now. And this is in the Been to the Mountaintop speech. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. So all of a sudden, he doesn't want to talk about people saying wait, which means never. He says, I've been to the mountaintop. And what's he calling to mind here? He's calling to mind Moses, Mount Nebo, where Moses was allowed by God to see the promised land, allowed to see it, but not enter it. It's a very, very interesting way for Martin Luther King to speak about himself, especially at that moment, April 3rd, 1968, because he went on to say, like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. As Dan mentioned earlier, remember, a Christian pastor. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. Here's where I want you to pay close attention. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to that promised land. Now, why would he think that in 1968? In one of the most tumultuous years in American history. As a matter of fact, the next morning, this picture was taken the next morning, April 4th, 1968, when he walked out of his Memphis hotel room. You'll see some of the other fellows with him are smiling and apparently quite happy. And yet, that was the last moment that he was alive on this earth. He was shot on that very balcony. You could see the three men who were with him all pointing to where they were pretty sure the shooter, who turned out to be James Earl Ray, where he stood as he took the shot that killed Martin Luther King. And just like that, the civil rights movement was thrown into complete disrepair. King was dead. What happens next when the greatest mouthpiece, who was indeed one of the most optimistic Americans there ever was, when he was just gone through such a senseless act of violence, an act of hatred that negated, apparently, what King had said for years about nonviolent resistance. He had advocated resisting a system in a country that kept his people under its boot, resisting them through nonviolent means. Meanwhile, Malcolm X is saying on the other side of the equation, we must achieve by any means necessary our goals. The ballot or the bullet, he would famously say. And King said no, and King paid the ultimate price. It's hard to explain just how profound a loss this was. Not just for Black America, but for America more simply. Black Americans felt it quite badly. But remember, King said, I've been to the mountaintop, calling to mind this idea of Moses wandering with the Jews for 40 years, not being able to get into the promised land, and yet being able to see it from a high vantage point that he was allowed the privilege to stand on for just a moment. And King, the night before he died, said, I've been to the mountaintop. I see it. I know how it's going to work. We have enough power as a group that we have to be taken seriously. And in 1963, when he wrote the letter from a Birmingham city jail and said, every time somebody says, just wait, what they're really saying is it's never going to happen. But now they can't say that anymore. Now it's inevitable. We will get past this. He saw that clearly in 1968 in a way that almost no one else did. And he was trying to implore his followers to go with him with that understanding in hand. So we ask ourselves, how has that worked out exactly over time? 1968 to, God help me, it's 2025 now. How are we doing? How are blacks doing in the United States? Was it inevitable? Well, as is the case with most political things, it's been a mixed bag. There are groups of people who will cheerily jump up and down and tell you that everything is so wonderful as to be nearly perfect, while others will scream and yell and make the case that things are so much worse now than they've ever been that it doesn't even bear discussion. Those people are all functionally crazy and should be ignored. So, what does a rational person think about these things as we go through our day to day lives? And I think, the first thing you have to realize is we had a black president. Ask yourself what the odds of that were in 1968 or prior to 1860. What would Jefferson and Madison and Adams say looking up at a picture of Barack Obama? They would be amazed that that could possibly have happened here. And yet it did. And when it did, we didn't make a gigantic deal out of it. Now, it was celebrated and people talked about it a bit, but it wasn't the one thing that we were going to talk about when we think about Barack Obama. We took him on his own merits. Some loved him, some hated him, and yet it had almost nothing to do with his skin color for anyone except a very thin strip of people on either political extreme. We, for the last 4 years, have had a black vice president. Didn't seem to be much of a big deal. Turns out she ran for president. She's not going to be president. We'll see what happens in the future, but I don't think gender or skin color really stands in the way of much of anybody, at least not in the big picture. If that doesn't convince you enough, the Congress that opens up in, well, I guess now, will have 67 black members, which is up from 7 in 1968. It's the most blacks we will ever have had in Congress. 67 up from 7. Hard not to see that as impressive. 2 justices on our Supreme Court are black. We tend not even to think about it. Did you know that before I just said it? Do you care now that I have said it? Probably not, right? And that would be all the evidence that things are going better, that these things are true, and you don't really care because that's not the important part. Everywhere you look in the United States right now, you would never be shocked to see a black person. These are country music performers, for crying out loud. We have black hockey players, something that was incomprehensible just a couple of generations ago. There is no field of human activity where blacks aren't welcome, participating, and in almost every case thriving. So maybe Martin Luther King had a pretty good point. Maybe it was inevitable from the view of the mountaintop that things were going to go pretty well. Unfortunately, it's not all good news. There is significant good news. It's hard to see the things I just pointed out and not really take a moment to appreciate the difference from 1968 to the present. However, the biting black poverty that was evidence in 1968 has gotten better, but it's not great. And there are other problems besides that any reasonable person would have to really think about. So I want to think about poverty. Black household poverty rate has declined about 30% since 1968, which is pretty significant. But blacks are still 2.5 times as likely to live in poverty than whites. 2.5 times. It's almost impossible to sugarcoat that sort of thing. What do we make of that? I don't know. 30%, a 30% approval rate since 1968 is impressive, but as it turns out, it's not nearly impressive enough. What about wealth? If income isn't the thing, if wealth is the thing that we need to talk about, um, the median black family had no wealth in 1968. I understand what I'm saying here. It means the median black family had $0 worth of wealth in 1968. That increased to 44,000 and some change in 2022. In 2022, the median white family had $284,000 in accumulated wealth. So $240,000 more. That's a pretty significant difference. I don't see a way to sugarcoat that. There's no way to look at that and say, clearly, there is no evidence of a problem here. When we think about something like home ownership, well, black home ownership sits at just over 40%, trailing whites by about 30 percentage points. Whites are about 70%. This rate has remained unchanged for 50 years. How on earth did that happen? That seems to be a bit of a problem. We look at education, and we'll start with college here, move on from there in a moment. The share of young blacks with college degrees has doubled to 23% since 1968. But blacks are still only half as likely to have completed a college education than whites. Only half. If you go to high school, it's a little stranger. We've got 90% of blacks graduating high school versus 93% for whites. So roughly the same outcome. How is it that we achieved roughly the same outcome with high school, and yet the difference in college is still 2 to 1, something that bears some consideration? What about life expectancy? That seems to be something that we would want to talk about quite a lot. And you can see that there is a 4-year difference, and the numbers jump around a bit here, 2021, 2022, 2023, but these are all post-pandemic numbers for the age expectancies that we see in the various groups we're thinking about. Whites simply do better than blacks by a solid 4 years, but look at what happens when we break it down into black and white men. Black men, boy, they're achieving at a lower rate than black women by a very considerable margin. Why is this? Well, a bit of it has to do with the ability of people to obtain good health care, right? Better health care yields longer lives. That's almost always a truism. So if you've got different groups in one country that live in basically the same place, have basically the same diet, have basically the same social realities, what do you look to? You look to healthcare. And it turns out that is a problem. You could also look to diet, though, and it turns out white and black diets are not the same, not completely. And some of the difference in their life expectancies is likely explainable by the foods they eat. Behavioral things always matter, but in the end, it's mostly medical care. And you're looking at a radically big difference here. Black women do considerably better than black men, but white women do considerably better than white men. So I think we would expect to see that difference. What do we make of this? Where does this leave us? What about have we made it to the promised land? Right? Was King right? He said it's inevitable that my people, his people, black people will do better in the United States. It's inevitable. Now, it's hard to make the case that that's not correct when one of their number can become president without most of us even raising an eyebrow. When the black middle class is actually quite vibrant and doing quite well compared to the white middle class. Right? Once you break it down into that kind of orientation, things look pretty good. The black poor versus the white poor, that doesn't look good at all. And what you realize is that not only is it a mixed bag today, it's always been, which I think raises the interesting question. Was King too optimistic? I know that's not a popular thing to ask on the day we celebrate his life, but maybe he was. Maybe he was just too optimistic. How will we know as a people when we've achieved that which he said was inevitable? Are we on the mountaintop looking in? Are we at the promised land? Have we failed completely? Are we in neither of those places? And I leave these as open questions on Martin Luther King Day because I think ultimately that's what they are. Most questions like these can't be answered with any great certitude in the United States. The best we can do is look up, take a look, and know about where we are. And I would implore you to do that for yourselves. Take a look around and ask, how are we doing as a people, assuming that the American people can be a singular people? Well, how are we doing? Are we leaving those of our number out? Are people left behind? Are opportunities open to everyone? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. I can tell you that there's no room that I can walk into, see black people in it, and think, that's odd. That's just never happened. Everywhere I go, I see people of all kinds of descriptions, and I never think it's weird that they're in the room. I see women where people of my parents' age never did. Does that seem weird? No. Does that mean women all have perfect opportunities? I don't know. You might. You might know better than I do. You certainly know differently than I do. So I want to leave it as an open question. Where does it leave us? Was there ever a mountaintop in the first place? If so, did we get to it? If so, did we get past it? And on that strange note, I'll take any questions you might have.
Dr. Harrigan, I'll start us off with a question as
Please.
people formulate their ideas. A wonderful cultural critic named Albert Murray says that in fact, there's no such thing any longer, and he was saying this back in the 50s and 60s, as white America or black America. He said, we're all omni-Americans. Most blacks have interacted with whites for centuries. Most whites have interacted with blacks. The cultures have mingled and become so at one in many respects. Now, he was writing in the 50s and 60s and saying, you know, we're all from the same civilization. Anybody can talk with Plato. Anybody can talk with Jesus. Anybody can talk with Martin Luther King, in essence, or interact with them. That there's the dragon to be slayed, which may have sat on top of the mountain, by the way, is always going to be there. That's what makes heroes. You have to have something to overcome. Sorry to use that word in this situation, to be a hero. And Martin Luther King was a hero. And what you said in your talk is that he was asking for moderates and the rest of the middle in the United States to stand up and be courageous. Is that part of the meaning of Martin Luther King Day, is that it takes something, and it's complicated what that is, for people to actually be courageous?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, blacks right now comprise about 14% of the American population. And you hear people saying, well, democracy is the only thing that matters. Well, if that were true, white majorities could just vote against everything that blacks wanted day in and day out. I mean, in fact, white majorities could hamstring the black minority as long as it wanted in any way that it chose. And yet we know that A, that's not right, and B, that's not even close to what happened, right? So what did happen? And it's interesting because you see it with blacks, you see it around the same time, but then again a bit later in the women's movement, and then you see it 30 or so years after that with what became the gay rights movement. And it always plays out in about the same way in the United States. It plays out very differently in other places, but in the United States, it plays out with a radically oppressed group. And I don't want to ever diminish that. He was talking about a group that had been radically oppressed for years, first under slavery, then under segregation, and then under various other problems that would emerge over the period of time in the 1950s, 1960s, and even into the 70s. Well, what happens? You get that group standing up saying, we deserve better. And King said, well, what do you have to say? You have to go to these business owners and tell them, we deserve better. It was his exact prescription. And once you do that, if they treat you better, great. Then you can go there and spend your money. If they don't, you have recourse. Go find somewhere else. And there were any number of companies that King told them in that speech not to do business with. He said, these companies are so bad, you should stop doing business with them right now. And that's kind of fascinating. But we all know that somehow, some way, if not perfectly, the situation was ameliorated to such a degree that we can say the civil rights movement was a success. An unqualified success? I don't really think so. A massive success? Okay, now I think I could find some agreement in the terminology. So wonderful, but not perfect. And then you see the same thing with the women's rights movement. Do women really feel oppressed in any meaningful way right now as compared to their counterparts in the very early 1970s? It's hard to make that case with any seriousness. And if anybody is experiencing a violent reaction to what I'm saying, I understand what I'm saying. And you should really look into things back in the 60s and 70s, 50s even. For women in the United States, it was more difficult than you might imagine. And it's changed more than you might think. It was almost unbelievable that women would be in college to greater percentages than men. The majority of college students in the United States now are women. Well, okay, it was unbelievable that gays could marry until one day that just seemed to change overnight. And you see in the United States that you get groups saying that's not fair, you have to do better. And to the eternal credit of the American people, they typically sit back a little too late, I might add, but they typically sit back and say, huh, is that right? Are we doing something wrong? Do we owe this group of people better? And you see them answering in the affirmative time and time again in a very big and meaningful way. And I think if we're thinking about the role that King played to bring that to fruition, heroic is the right word. His participation was absolutely heroic. And then people who followed along after him were heroic in their own smaller ways.
Cool. We've got a bunch of questions, so I'm going to start. We'll maybe go with, mm, uh, am I just being romantic or nostalgic? Or does the quality of the oratory of our present-day political leaders or cultural elite pale in comparison to the abilities of MLK, JFK, RFK, Roosevelt, Churchill, etc.? Is this true? If so, why? Are we too
It's at,
smart to buy a silver tongue or too stupid to demand better?
I absolutely love every word of that question. Now I have to say horrible things. Yes, it's absolutely true. And if you've ever listened to King, or you named one of my all-time favorites, Winston Churchill, there were other greats who would step up to a microphone and say things, and the world would move. We talk now about moving the needle. These guys moved the needle. And it goes, I think, into the 1980s with Thatcher and Reagan. I think they were both very good orators, very good behind a microphone. After that, it's a long road to the bottom. And I leave it to you to figure out why. The things I would offer as possibilities are the things you're already thinking, right? The various internet stupidities that we involve ourselves with on a daily basis have drawn our attention span from hours to minutes to seconds, and that's probably a big part of it. Am I going to blame TikTok for leading to a Chinese takeover of America? No, but I'll blame it on the endless swiping that took away our attention span. Um, and remember, politicians only give the people what the people want. So there was a time when people expected the politicians to deliver brilliant oratory. That time has passed. Now we get exactly what we want. And sadly, we don't want what I would consider and what the question, whoever asked the question, would obviously consider good enough. Our standards have fallen quite badly. Sad
Here's
though it
another
is.
question which I'm going to at least somewhat answer before you do, but I'll let you decide it. How can we, as privileged college students, best celebrate MLK Day so that the history is remembered and honored? And I would just quickly say, and I'll see if you disagree, one is a sense of gratitude for being able to celebrate this great leader. And then two would be this kind of presentation, rather than going off drinking at the pub or drinking at the bar, you are listening to this and taking stock of who this person was and what he meant to America. Your take on that? Know that we do
Yeah,
have a bunch of questions to go through.
I think that's right. I would only add that there's no problem with the bar. Everything has its own time and place. Um, and I would say, in addition to what Dan just said, which I think gratitude, yes, but also kindness and decency, two things that I think are in very, very short supply in the 2020s. And I think we should all, and look, at my advanced age, I can't tell you that I know much. I know less now than I did when I was 30, which is a bit of an oddity. Um, Yet I do know that we should be a lot nicer to each other, and it's very, very difficult to do that. So, kindness.
So you're a political philosopher.
Indeed, I am.
You know that therefore there are trade-offs in human existence. If there were not to be any racism, if there were not to be any anti-Semitism, it would mean that we would be treating those people who hold that as criminals for holding those ideas, and then finding ways, therefore, to delimit democracy and freedom. In other words, there's always a trade-off between freedom and the things that we would like people not to do. The question somebody asks in regards to that, I think, in a broader context, is can we consider where we are now little wins as mini mountaintops? I love metaphor, by the way. Metaphor is a way of understanding the world that's probably richer than any that we know.
Yeah.
And
No,
that's why
it,
MLK's talk about being at the top of the mountain is so welcome.
I've
Anyway,
I've never heard that particular metaphor, and I actually rather like it. I think that's
yeah,
right. We've done so well over time that the things we think are quite horrible now would barely have made a dent in 1968. And you have to accept that as a rather meaningful victory. But you can't accept it as a complete victory, because if you do, you stop trying. And there's plenty left to try about.
of course, there always will be as long as we're dealing with human beings.
Yeah.
Not that I was saying I want people to be racist or want them to be anti-Semitic. Au contraire, to the contrary. But if you can't control people's minds, all you can do is educate and hope that it will work. Why do you believe people of this generation try to hyperbolize the current situation and dynamic between races?
I think the answer is very simple because they didn't experience a period in which bloodshed was actually occurring. I think they see the problems that they have. They diagnose them correctly as problems, and they fail to situate the degree of the problem in front of them into its historical sweep. I just think that's the only answer I think that makes any sense or carries any water. Um, I think hyperbolizing things, it's a good word that you used when you thought about this problem. Hyperbolizing things is a mistake because then you're not addressing the problem, you're addressing some kind of massive caricature of the problem. And as long as you're talking and dealing with caricature, you never really get to the truth. You get to a vision of the truth, which is pretty far afield. So I think it's largely a result that things were so good for so long, or so much better for so long, is probably a way of putting it, that now generations have gone by who never really lived through things like race riots or lynchings or things like this. Given that some of us have, very old people, I never lived through a lynching, I lived through a race riot once. That wasn't great. Things were different once upon a time, and they were not as good. And it does us well to remember that.
Okay, what do you think of the Black Lives Matter approach to making things more equal? Do you really
To
think?
making to making things more equal, I don't know. I don't think it really works well to make things equal. It doesn't even work well to make things equal within the Black Lives Matter movement, where some at the top were siphoning off large amounts of money in order to live cushy, comfortable lives, while others were out doing what they thought was good, solid civil rights work. It does, on the other hand, do pretty well at keeping a matter in front of white eyes that tends to disappear over time. And, you know, there's a joke I tell a lot on my podcast or when I speak in public, and it's a little more personal than talking into a computer screen, not knowing who's sitting out there. But the ubiquitousness of cell phones has taught me only three things, right? That everybody has a cell phone in his pocket everywhere. Because of that, I have learned three things. Bigfoot does not exist. UFOs are not landing everywhere in the United States, abducting people. And the blacks were telling the truth about their treatment at the hands of the police the whole time.
Mhm.
So when you can finally admit that, I think you can move on and you can deal with it. But you have to admit it first. And the Black Lives Matter movement put that issue front and center and said, okay, white people, take a good long look. And again, it's the same kind of thing that the civil rights movement and the gay rights movement and the women's movement all did and succeeded in. So here we are again at the same old ground. And I think we're probably better for it, even if that was a deeply imperfect movement. Most movements are imperfect.
Just reiterate what MLK meant when he said, "I've been to the mountaintop." Briefly
Well,
and
you know, he's making the point that he, like Moses, spent a lot of his life working towards a very laudable, difficult, and unlikely goal. And at the end of his life, and isn't it odd that he knew he was at the end of his life? At the end of his life, he said, look, I may go with you into the promised land, but I might not. But either way, that's okay, because up here on this mountain, I can see it. I can see it clearly. He saw it clearly as Moses saw it when God brought him up to the mountain and said, there it is, there's the promised land. And Martin Luther King was not saying, I'm Moses, but he was saying, as was the case with Moses, I've led you as long and as well as I could. I've made mistakes. I've had great victories. I might not be allowed to live out a long life with you. That doesn't mean we won't have won.
Mhm. What's exactly the demographic graphic of the willingness of African Americans to seek medical care, both through hospital and reproductive care, in correlation to the geographical poverty demographic?
Yeah,
I think that
you're that's a complicated question that I can't answer fully here, but you're on exactly the right track when you're looking for an answer for it. And I'll complicate it a little further. Um, the black population, roughly 55% of the American black population, is concentrated into what we typically call the South, more appropriately called the Southeast. So any answer you come up with to address that question probably needs to take that geography into account, as well as the fact that we have a good number, not a majority, I don't believe anymore, but a sizable minority of blacks living in inner cities, which typically have better health care if you're on the right side of town, or much, much worse health care if you're not. So you see the confounding variables that come with even the first couple of cuts at this. The simple fact of the matter is that blacks don't get the same quality of healthcare as their white counterparts in the United States. And you could also throw in Asians and Indians, and take your pick. Um, so the question there is, well, why the hell not? Haven't we already crossed all of these lines? Why are we still having these sorts of disparities? And I think those are questions well worth asking. I don't have much of an answer to that particular one.
so. This is going to be a hard one for a short answer, but let's give it a try because we have more questions. What do you think MLK would have thought about the protests following the killing of George Floyd? I
I don't
believe the recent examples of police brutality on Black Americans serves an example of how we as a nation have not reached the mountaintop. Do you think MLK would agree with this? Let me just ask the anonymous attendee to please go read the work of Heather MacDonald on this question. Heather MacDonald.
it's an
Go ahead.
interesting question, right? Because there's no way to know the answer. There's only pure conjecture. And remember the imagery that King gave us when he talked about the mountaintop. He could see the promised land. That doesn't mean anybody else could, and it certainly didn't mean anybody was there. He could just see it. They were close enough. It was within grasp. What would he have said about the George Floyd protests? I don't know. Over all those years, from his death to what happened with in the aftermath of what we euphemistically call George Floyd, um, would he have changed his mind about peaceful protests? Would he have said, well, maybe we have to get a little more violent here to get the answers we deserve? And to that, I don't know. I suspect he wouldn't have. But I also suspect that, there's only so much any one person can take over time. And if he lived another 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, and still saw the same problems happening, I suspect his frustration level would have been very high. I don't know. I don't know what the answer would have been. I know that he saw things far worse than George Floyd. Far, far worse. And that didn't break his spirit, which is astonishing because I'm pretty sure it would have broken mine.
Mhm. This is an interesting question. Here, I'm going to ask you to apply your philosophical understanding and or that as an educator, because I have a particular take on this. Do you think that being a white man, you might not be able to fully understand a woman's or black person's experience?
Yeah, I suspect that all the time, just as I suspect they can't understand mine. Um, but that doesn't mean I don't think about it or that I shouldn't, and that I shouldn't have opinions on it. I have empathy. We all do. And we can see what our fellows are going through, regardless of whether they're exactly like us or not. I think we're all enough alike that it's pretty easy to abstract. And I can tell you that if I were alive in 1968, I don't think I would have been a follower of King. I think I probably would have been with Malcolm X. I think I would have been violent, right? And that tells me something, and it tells me a lot about the grace of the people who went with King and how they did everything in their considerable power to be non-confrontational but unwavering in their demands. And I appreciate those things as a human being. Do I understand them as a white man? Maybe to a lesser extent than a black man might, or a black woman, or an Asian woman, take your pick. But I think it's incumbent upon all of us to understand each other as best we can. And the more we do that, the better we tend to treat each other as well. So that would be my answer to that.
So there are a couple of questions I don't think we're going to have time to answer, and I'll paraphrase what I think is the last one because you just talked about violence. So uh, the questioner asks, so what about violence in relation to the Revolutionary War?
Yeah. Yeah. Violence is and has always been a political tool. Take that for whatever it's worth, right? We tend to say the revolutionary generation was the greatest generation. Well, okay, they killed a bunch of people to get their goal, to achieve their goal. Um, is that always acceptable? Is it never acceptable? These are open questions. I'll say only this: it's on the table all the time at every political moment. I think the best of us find ways not to resort to violence. The worst of us resort to it far too quickly. The rational among us know that it's always a possibility.
Mhm.
King knew it was a possibility and urged everyone to go with a better option. And for that, I think he deserves this day, and I think the day deserves to be celebrated every year with real devotion.
Mhm. Other questions, I'm going to have you look up some of the content of your questions. Ana Padilla, I'm going to have you do that, and also Melanie Gottlieb. But thank you all for your questions. They are all thoughtful.
The
Uh,
questions were really fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your
really,
time.
and to Gabriella Fountain, there is the notion of a just war. So that would be something for you to pursue to see what, in fact, humans have decided when it is a time to actually employ violence to kill your enemy. Um, I wish you all a wonderful Martin Luther King Day, however you continue now to celebrate it, maybe to ask some of these questions again. And for all of you, a good year, since it's also the beginning of a new year, whether you are a student or whether you are a lay member of the audience, as it were. And do come back again for further presentations of the Cultured Mind Forum, of which this was a part. So I wish you all a good evening and take care.